Good afternoon and good morning, depending upon where you are. I welcome all distinguished guests, excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, and my dear colleagues. On behalf of National Middle East Institute, National University of Singapore, which has organized this webinar on a very interesting theme, whose title is Iran's Presidential Election Impact on the Islamic Republic's Policies. And to discuss that, we have four very renowned speakers from their respective fields who have joined us in this webinar. And I will just introduce them for you. We have the first speaker who is Dr. Sanam Vakil, who is a Deputy Director and Senior Research Fellow of the Middle East and North Africa Program at the Royal Institute of International Affairs, Chatham House. Dr. Vakil is also the James Anderson Professorial Lecturer in the Middle East Studies Department at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies in Bologna, Italy. In the past, she has also served as an Assistant Professor of Middle East Studies at SAIS, Washington, and served as a Research Associate at the Council on Foreign Relations. We have the second speaker, who is Professor Manusher Dorraj, who is a professor of international affairs at Adran College of Liberal Arts, Texas Christian University, Fort Worth, Texas. He has previously taught at the University of Texas at Austin and Shanghai International Studies University. He was earlier a visiting fellow at Georgetown Center for International and Regional Studies in Doha, Qatar, and also a visiting scholar at Fudan University Development Institute in Shanghai, China. We have the third speaker joining us, Dr. Mahmoud Pargu. He is a research fellow at the Middle East Studies Forum at Alfred Deakin Institute, Deakin University, Australia. He is the author of Secularization of Islam in Post-Revolutionary Iran and co-author of Presidential Elections in Iran, Islamic Idealism Since the Revolution. Dr. Pargu has published in a variety of media outlets, including Al Monitor, BBC, ABC, The Atlantic, Asia Times, and The Diplomat. Now, finally, we have the fourth speaker, whose name is Dr. Razim, who is an expert on Iran, who is currently affiliated as a research fellow with the Institute for National Studies, National Security Studies, Tel Aviv University. He holds a master's degree and a PhD in Middle Eastern history from Tel Aviv University. Dr. Zimt is also a visiting research fellow at the Alliance Center for Iranian Studies at Tel Aviv University. In addition, he is the editor of a Spotlight on Iran, published by the Mir Amit in the Intelligence and Terrorism Information Center. So we have a real stellar panel for today's discussion. And as the title suggests, we shall be actually looking at the difference in Iranians' domestic and foreign policies after the election of the current president-elect, Ebrahim Raisi. Because a lot of interest has been generated because this person is not only being seen as the next president, assuming charge in office, but also as a very likely successor of the supreme leadership position. So that is why the whole world is viewing. And this election has come also at a time when only a few months ago, a new president has been elected in the United States, whose policy to a great extent impacts Iranian domestic policy as well as foreign policy. And very interestingly, in Israel also, with which a very conflicting nature of relationship Iran shares, has also elected its new leader. So this is a very interesting dynamic where we are going to discuss the presidential election and the outcome of it. Before beginning, I'll just inform the usual technique of asking questions in Zoom by whether typing it on the Zoom chat function, or you may also raise your hand, and we shall unmute you and you can ask your question. And I also, in the beginning, would like to thank two of my colleagues, Dr. Alexandro Arduino and Dr. James M. Dorsey, who have been helping me in organizing this conference behind the scene. And our speakers will be speaking for about 10 to 12 minutes, after which we will have question and answer session. So we begin with our first speaker, Dr. Sanam Vakil, who shall be letting us know about the ground level democracy, or the facade of democracy, or real or partial, virtual, whatever. She would actually be telling us the exact nature of the political socialization in Iran, because everybody is interested to know not only about the outcome or the impact of it, but what actually is the actual activities amongst people related to the political, system. So, Dr. Sanam Vakil, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Shoja. It's such a pleasure to be here with you today. Thank you to you and your colleagues for the kind invitation. I'm looking above all forward to hearing what the rest of my esteemed panelists have to say. So I'll try to keep my comments brief, and I'm looking forward to the discussion and the questions as well. You asked me to provide sort of an on-the-ground look at what has been happening in Iran. And I think that the context is very important. Iran has been beset by a number of internal as well as external challenges. And this, of course, has very much impacted the political climate inside the country. I think it's important to remember that in 2015, Iran, the Iranian government signed the Iran nuclear agreement known as the JCPOA. And this agreement was signed just shortly after the election of the current or the outgoing Iranian president, Hassan Rouhani. And voter participation in Rouhani's first election was quite high. Really, his principal political policy that he was advocating was Iran's participation in a nuclear agreement that would give Iran sanctions relief and would offer the country and individuals better economic opportunity. There was a lot of I would say a groundswell of support for this arrangement at the popular level, and this has been clear in polling that was taken around the JCPOA and also in engaging with Iranians at different levels and across many sectors and provinces. I can personally say that there was a degree of enthusiasm that was quite unprecedented. This climate, though, has very much shifted for a variety of reasons. President Rouhani has been in power for 8 years. Through this period, the country has experienced significant challenges, not just with the implementation of the JCPOA that for many Iranians didn't deliver in the way that they expected it to, but also because the Trump administration, you will remember, was very critical of the Iran nuclear agreement. And despite Iranian compliance with that agreement that was verified on multiple occasions by the International Atomic Energy Agency, President Trump withdrew from the JCPOA and over a 2.5-year period began to impose graduated but very restrictive sanctions on the Iranian economy and on the Iranian political establishment. These sanctions prevented Iran from exporting oil, but also from engaging in broader commercial activities, as effectively all of its sectors were sanctioned. It also prevented the Iranian government from accessing the international banking system, which prevented it from also accessing its foreign reserves that have built up to very high levels in bank accounts all around the world. The consequence of this is that obviously ordinary Iranians bore the principal pain of sanctions through this period. Inflation has skyrocketed, hitting informally around 40%. Unemployment has increased. The currency was devalued on a number of occasions, all as the government tried to economically survive through this period. And they did survive. The country didn't collapse. The economy did not collapse, although there were two, if not more, two huge protests that spread throughout the country, principally driven by economic grievances. These protests were seen in December and January of 2017, 2018, and November 2019 over rising gas prices. Those protests, of course, were quite shocking by how quickly they spread around to smaller Iranian cities as well. but they were also quite brutally repressed, and the government through this period has stepped up coercive measures to monitor the population, to prevent the outbreak of further protests. So this has also very much impacted the climate in Iran. So already these are three challenges: disappointment, economic challenges, the impact of sanctions, growing repression. And then you can sort of add to that the fact that the Islamic government through this period decided to push back against the US maximum pressure campaign, and began to transfer pressure into the region. In the summer of 2019, we saw an outbreak of tensions in the Persian Gulf, the downing of a US drone, attacks on Saudi oil facilities. This, of course, adds to a certain psychological and stress within the country. On January 3rd, 2020, Iran's foremost IRGC commander Qasem Soleimani was killed in Iraq by a US strike. And a few days after that attack, the Iranian government mistakenly downed a Ukrainian airliner, killing all of the passengers on board. So, that's a lot for a 2.5-year period. And I think for a population to bear. And then came COVID. Iran has had the highest death rate of COVID throughout the Middle East. And again, under the pressure of sanctions, it's had a lackluster, or let's say limited ability to respond. It is potentially experiencing a fifth wave right now amid an environmental crisis. There are currently also worker protests spreading throughout the country. So I'm presenting to you this huge sort of picture of what ordinary Iranians have been through, really to sort of to highlight that this election was hugely important for a number of reasons. This election saw the lowest public participation in a presidential election in 42 years. Normally, election results are definitely over the 50% mark, and in certain cases have been as high as 80% in terms of popular participation. And this election generated very little enthusiasm, with 48% participating. And because of the heavy vetting that took place of the candidates by this institution known as the Guardian Council, the candidates that were presented for the people to vote for were not terribly inspiring. And interestingly, also as an outcome, so President Raisi, who will be sworn in shortly, obviously received the most votes, but the second highest votes were blank or spoiled ballots. And this is a growing and sort of relatively novel phenomenon. So protest votes also increased in this period. And I think this points to a few issues. Obviously, there is a growing disenchantment between state and society that is very clear. Add to that is a growing frustration with reformists and centrist or moderate politicians that haven't been able to deliver campaign promises, or haven't been able to deliver very much in terms of reform, social liberalization, economic improvements, and the like. So if you add these sort of layers together, it very much explains why people have checked out. And there is a past pattern in Iranian elections that when the population doesn't engage, it sort of opens the door and allows for conservatives to win at the ballot box. And this very much took place. A final note, and this is, Iranian elections are generally unpredictable. Those of us who follow Iran have learned many a lesson over past elections at being predictive. What was unpredictable or here was this was the first predictable election that we have experienced in, I think, 20 years in the case of Iran. And in advance of elections, really public discussion becomes much more engaging in the society, so that the state tries to generate more public participation, more interest. They try to inspire people through the debates, and the debates this year were also particularly uninspiring. And I'm sure my colleagues will talk about the policy issues more in depth. But quite interestingly, politicians and politically engaged individuals really use the social media application Clubhouse in a very unique way in advance of the elections, taking to Clubhouse to hold very large policy discussions and to discuss a broad array of issues that they were, let's say, putting forward. And so a number of the prominent candidates, or even some of the disqualified candidates like former President Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, held Clubhouse discussions with thousands of Iranians listening in. And for those of us on the outside, unable to go back, and you know, unable to, let's say, have such close access, this was a really fascinating phenomenon. It was, I think, really interesting to be part of those discussions, to listen into the questions, and to watch how the political establishment made use of Clubhouse as a campaign tool, and perhaps this campaign tool generated more interest and momentum and engagement than the entire campaign did itself. Just finally, what does this all say in terms of where we're going? I mean, we know President Raisi has won. He has a huge number of challenges ahead of him. And I think primary above them are economic. So knowing that the population is quite disenchanted, I think that as a president, the best strategy for him is to take a very strong economic platform and carry that forward in an effort to improve governance issues that have clearly exacerbated a divide between the political establishment and ordinary Iranians. So I'll stop there. Thank you very much, and looking forward to the rest of my fellow panelists' comments.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sanam. Fascinating, and especially the political socialization that you have mentioned. Voting to protest that we will not vote, you know. So the protest vote going highest in numbers, so actually they are voting, but saying also we will not vote. I mean, there's a duality in every realm of Iranian society, not only in power. And also Clubhouse, the phenomena that all of us are keenly watching in the age of technology. So how much that actually sees the light of the day. With that, we now move on to our second panelist, Professor Durraj from Texas, and he's actually better positioned to tell us about the US policy, especially under President Biden. What exactly is it? It's very enigmatic these days, what exactly President Biden wants with Iran. So please highlight us, and especially under the background of this election of Ebrahim Raisi. Professor Durraj, your floor.
Thank you very much for the kind invitation, and especially Dr. Shuja and his colleagues who organized this webinar and allowed me to have an audience with you all, but also exchange ideas with our esteemed colleagues who are members of the panel. And I think it's instructive to look at some of the constraint, what I would call structural constraint that Biden administration works under. If I have time at the end, I would also talk about a structural constraint on the Iranian side and why I see if we do reach a JCPOA agreement in Vienna in, let's say, a few months down the line, I see that as a ceiling, not a foundation for transformative changes in US-Iran relations. Let me state that. First of all, there are no significant constituencies in the United States who favor dramatic improvement of relation with Iran, rapprochement, grand bargain, anything of the sort. Quite to the contrary. We know that Republicans en masse were opposed to JCPOA to begin with. They supported Trump's maximum pressure campaign. And we also know that since Biden has come to the office, some more supposedly moderate Democrats, Senator Menendez, for example, wrote a joint letter with Senator Graham, a Republican, Menendez, a Democrat, urging him to hold on to Trump-era sanctions and use them as leverage to grant more concession from Iran. And we also know that Hillary Clinton wing of the Democratic Party has always been very hawkish on Iran policy. So what remains that really is in favor of a new look at Iran is the progressive wing of the Democratic Party, which is very small and not very influential. So that's US Congress. And when we get to the larger Washington think tanks and establishment, really the neoconservatives in some ways have gone mainstream on Iran policy. And there's, if you will, an institutional enmity at this point on both sides, which has been cemented by years of, if you will, not only mistrust, but also lack of harmony between leadership in Tehran and leadership in Washington. When, for example, President Khatami, who spoke of great American civilization and who spoke of necessity for dialogue of civilization, including dialogue with the United States, and was in favor of improvement of relation, we get George W. Bush. Of course, during the first term, we have Bill Clinton, who's in the office, and hardliners on the Iranian side did not want to see Khatami, who represents the reform side of Iranian spectrum, to get the benefit of normalizing relation or improving relation with US. So that, because of the intransigence of the hardliners, did not come to pass. And when US had President George W. Bush in the office, of course, he wanted none of this rapprochement with Iran. And basically, Iran was told after US invasion of Iraq that you're next. So the second issue that is very important to note is that there is no foreign policy crisis in the United States. When you think of cost-benefit analysis of Biden administration, that would obviate the Biden administration to reach out to Iran beyond nuclear agreement or beyond JCPOA. To just give you a historical example that drives this point home, when US reached out to China, US had major problem in Vietnam and wanted to get out of Vietnam, peace with honor, as Nixon would call it. And the realization was reached under Henry Kissinger that the source of problem in Vietnam is with China and Soviet Union. We need to strike a deal with them. And that compels Nixon, a Republican, to go to China and so-called open the door to China, normalization of relation with China, and recognition of China in 1976 ensues after normalization, after Nixon's trip in 1972. So there is no compelling foreign policy crisis that a better relation with Iran is going to solve for the United States. That's another constraint, and doesn't matter in this regard who is in the office. And then the third one, I think Israel also, I'm sure Professor Zimt is going to talk in more detail about this, and I'm very interested to hear his analysis. But Israel also plays a very significant role in US calculus regarding Iran. The two sides, since Biden administration came to office, had national security team collaborating, cooperating, brainstorming. And Israel is also very entrenched and does not want to see any new concession made to Iranian government. So these are some of the grand, if you will, constraints that Biden administration works on. But on the other hand, if we look at the Iranian side, it reinforces the Biden administration's hand. Biden administration came to the office talking about a better and a bigger deal with Iran. And they wanted to use the leverage of sanctions from Trump era, maximum pressure, to bring Iran to negotiation table, not just on JCPOA. They wanted to use that as a foundation to negotiate Iran missile system, Iran behavior, political behavior regionally, its support of militias, etc. And on the Iranian side, their idea of forward defense and the idea that we don't have an Air Force missile is all the deterrent that we got, has made them to come and say, and President-elect Raisi has said it very openly, missile system is not up for negotiation, neither is our policies regionally. And that, therefore, makes me to conclude that if we reach any agreement on JCPOA, that would be the ceiling. That's the best we can expect at this point. And I don't see any follow-on negotiation. In addition, I think what happened under Trump administration, that Biden administration was dealt a hand that it had to work with, was that maximum pressure was designed not only ultimately for regime change, create economic implosion through mass protests and all that, that would lead to political implosion inside Iran, but also the whole policy of assassination of General Soleimani was to make sure that if there are any future government in US who wants to mend bridges with Iran, that would be very difficult to do. And indeed it is. As we know, current negotiation is in an indirect negotiation precisely because of that. So that's another factor, which is, I think, structural. And insofar as that does not change these structural issues. And on the Iranian side, Iran also, after this 25-year contract or agreement with China, feels that they have an alternative. There's a consensus between both the reform wing and the hardliners on the necessity of survival of the regime and how it is linked to its Eastern strategy, that is expansion of ties with China and with Russia. And they also see their integration, because the US sanctions basically has boycotted Iran from global economy. Its banking system, its oil and gas, everything. And Biden hasn't removed any sanctions substantially so far. So far as they're concerned, their integration back into the global economy is gonna go through China's Belt and Road. And therefore, that has given them some autonomy not to give concession on other issues. And this is where we are right now. And I want to leave it at that and be happy to come back and talk about some more detail when we talk about other issues that our audience may have questions about.
Thank you so much, Professor. I think you have quite a bit demystified the ambivalence that we see, in President Biden's approach towards Iran. What exactly are those compulsions? We are nearer that understanding. And now we move on to our third speaker, that is Dr. Mahmoud Pargu. He has just written his book on Iranian presidential election has been released. Oh, he'll be showing us that book. Okay, great. Very timely book. It's last month released, 2 months ago it has been released. And because now we have discussed the grassroots level of political socialization and the top level of the modeling of that, which is a lot of it is guided by the US policy. Now we shall be looking deep into the structural framework of the position of president or the office of presidency in the Iranian political system. Because in the current realm, we see that whenever we talk about president, we also talk, intermingle it with the office of supreme leader. So how exactly is the personality of Ebrahim Raisi driving that political position of presidency? So the structural as well as the personal dimension. Dr. Pargu, please, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dr. Asif. Thank you for all our audience and our esteemed panelists. This book actually is written by me and Professor Shahram Akbarzadeh from Deakin University, so it's a co-authored book, just to mention his contribution. And I guess now he is available here among the audience. I hope he will come and give comments after our talk. Let's go and focus first on elections in Iran. Elections in Iran are a bit of very odd and mixed mixture of really authoritarian system or structure mixed with a popular sovereignty issue. The authoritarian religious part is mainly manifested in the supreme leader and other different bodies and organizations, institutes of power below his, under his control. Like one is the armed forces, the state broadcasting company, the powerful guardian council, which is the institutional body vetting the the candidates for the president and other candidates of Majlis or parliament, and many other power stations. And so you have four main democratic, not democratically elected, but four main electoral bodies. One is president, which is elected by the direct vote. One is Majlis or parliament. The other one is the Majlis Khobregan or expert councils or parliament, which is sanctioned to select the leader, and the other one city councils. But all of these are limited. Basically, not everybody is welcome to be elected. So the Guardian Council has to insert the to qualify or to approve the qualifications of candidates. And as we have seen in the last few years, this has been increasingly, the disqualification rate has been increasing in the last few years, and before that, even in the last decade, has been increasing. So you have this very serious hurdle in front of the democracy. Then after in the parliament, you have laws. The laws needs to be again approved by the Guardian Council against the Sharia and the Constitution. So all of these restrictions are there. Then how powerful is president? First of all, the president, which can come from really serious opposition, is difficult or impossible, because they will be disapproved by the Guardian Council. So normally, and what is the range of this difference, or say how tolerant has been the Guardian Council or the regime to different parties or candidates? So this has been, again, increasingly tightening, and it's being restrictive. So there was a time in 1997 that Mohammad Khatami was allowed to run. But after that, this, restrictions has been increasing. So in 2017, Mahmoud Ahmadinejad was banned from running. In 2013, Hashemi Rafsanjani was banned from running. And of course, in this, election in this year, almost all, not even opposition, but moderate candidates were banned. So it has been restricting, so basically, as I put it, the regime is kind of losing its risk appetite. So it's not willing anymore to accept, some serious candidates that could make some, momentum into political structure. This is in terms of how legally the president, the legal powers of the president. Well, in terms of reality, the reality is that president has lots of, different instruments and institutions under his control. Some of them, they are more, I mean, in domestic politics, he has more open-handed, open hand to influence some policies, but not fundamental policies of the state. In foreign policy, main fundamental policies are dictated by the supreme leader through National Security Council. And that National Security Council, around 6 to 7 members are appointed by the president, and other 7 members are appointed by the supreme leader. So always there is some place for negotiation, but this room for negotiation again is very narrow. So there are not that much of that much of changes that president can make without the approval of the supreme leader. So when it comes to new President-elect Raisi, again, all of these apply. So Raisi, like Rouhani, wasn't able to do this. Raisi will not be able to change the policies, the main fundamental policies of foreign policy or domestic policy that much. And this, of course, is important because against the expectations that Raisi is a very hardliner president, is coming to, dismantle everything. He, probably the pragmatic approach of the regime will change, somehow pragmatic, and all of those things. I don't think so. So I don't expect that much of policy changes in foreign policy, whether in domestic policy, to happen. Partly because of, as I said about this, the legal structure, the legal, limits he has, and the limited maneuvering space he has. But also because his personality, and again, unlike what we hear in many of media reports, he is not that much of a hawkish president as people I see they portray him. So he's actually among hard conservatives. He has a kind of reputation of being a pragmatist, and at least as far as compared to other hardliners like Jalili, who actually they had some confrontation in one of the television debates. So I don't think that much of changes, but again, they are different from conservatives and moderates. They have different, people have different expectations. They have to somehow, have an eye on their support. They are supportive, support bases, and somehow satisfy their expectations. So it will not be like before, but it hasn't been, it will not be a revolutionary path like being too much hawkish, or say to escalate the foreign policy decisions. And or even in domestic policy, we will have the same thing. So I don't expect too much of changes actually in both parts. So I will be happy to answer the questions if there were any. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Mahmood. So you have aptly highlighted the regime has lost its risk appetite. So what has replaced it, it would be interesting to see. And with that, we move on to our fourth and perhaps equally important speaker, because Israel, or the discourse of Israel within the Iranian, strategic discourse is like that of iceberg. Just one part of it is visible, the two part is not visible, but it determines to a large extent, whether the authorities accept it or not, the influence of Israel or the whole existence of Israel in Iranian foreign policy. So any security arrangement that we talk in terms of the region vis-a-vis Iran, Israel's role is extremely important. So to highlight throw some light on these aspects, we have very renowned scholar, Dr. Raz, from a very renowned institution. Dr. Raz, the floor is yours.
So good morning. Thank you very much, Dr. Shuja and my fellow panelists. Yes, well, it took the Iranians 8 years to replace President Rouhani, and it took the Israelis 12 years to replace Prime Minister Netanyahu. So I will certainly address to this as well. But let me say a few words about my thoughts concerning the regional policy of Iran under Raisi, and I certainly agree with Dr. Pargu with what he said. Look, I don't want to underestimate the importance of the Iranian president. As we know, he chairs the Supreme National Security Council, and President Rouhani, at least in his first term as president, did try in a way to balance a little bit perhaps the significance or the importance of what Dr. Vakil has written an excellent piece on the deep state in Iran, mainly the Revolutionary Guards. But we should not also overestimate the importance of the president. And you probably all remember the leaked tape of Foreign Minister Zarif a few months ago, where he spoke about this tension between the diplomacy and the Maidan, between the diplomacy and the battlefield. And as we know, the Iranian political system has always been characterized with this tension between the so-called revolutionary institutions and the so-called Republican institution elected by the people. And so I would say that I too do not anticipate major changes in the Iranian policy, especially in its foreign and regional policy under Raisi. As Foreign Minister Zarif himself said, that when it comes to the regional policy of Iran, the main responsibilities lie with the Revolutionary Guards. And we probably all remember 2 or 3 years ago when Foreign Minister Zarif actually wanted to resign after the Syrian President Assad visited Iran, and he was not even, Zarif was not even aware of this visit until he listened in the news. I would say, however, that if we should expect some changes in Iran's regional policy, I would say that it's not because of the new government or the new president in Iran, but it's more because of the growing challenges Iran has been facing in the region over the last few years. And I don't have the time to elaborate on all those challenges, but let me just mention a few of them. What we've seen over the last decade in the Middle East seems to be, and some of my Israeli colleagues would describe that as an Iranian success story. Why a success story? Because when you look at the level of Iranian interference and influence in the region, in Syria, in Iraq, and in Yemen, there is certainly a much more increased interference and influence by Iran in those states. Having said that, my personal view has always been that when you look at the Iranian influence in the so-called Arab Middle East in the recent decades, it has more to do with the weakness of the Arab world rather than to the strength of Iran. And what we've seen over the last 2 or 3 years is that Iran has been facing more and more challenges in the regions. Just to mention a few of them. First, the stabilization in Iraq and in Syria, which has made it much more difficult to Iran to legitimize it, to give explanations to the level of interference in those countries. The second thing, which of course is connected to the first issue, is what we've seen as a growing public criticism against Iranian influence in the region. We've seen the protests going on in Beirut. We've seen the protests going on in Iraq, not just among the Sunnis in the region, but also among Shiite. And we all remember the events of protesters in Basra or in Karbala torching Iranian consulates there, not because they do not want good relationship between Iraq and Iran, but because they really, they want Iran to move away from this interference in the domestic politics of the states in the region. Another problem Iran is facing is that it has learned that it is not the only player in the region. And whenever you look around, whether it's Syria or Iraq or Yemen, Iran is just one player. So again, I don't have the time to elaborate on that. But if you take Syria, for example, the Israeli military activities certainly limited the extent of Iran's entrenchments in Syria. We've had several reports about competition between Iran and Russia over the issue of economic participation in the reconstruction of Syria. Turkey is another important player, both in Syria and Iraq, and of course the United States, which is still a major player. The assassination of Soleimani was also very important. And I do not think that the assassination or the death of Soleimani changed Iran's strategy in the region, but there is no doubt that Soleimani was a very successful combination, I would say, between a military general and a very good politician. And he really managed to create this network of connections between Iran and its allies, its partners, its proxies in the region. And with all due respect to his successor, Ismail Rouhani, I doubt it if he has the ability to continue the efforts and the success of Soleimani. And the two last issues, the two last constraints I would like to raise. One is, of course, the Abraham Accords between Israel and the Gulf states. Now, I don't think that we should anticipate any kind of a coalition between Israel and its new partners in the Gulf, the UAE or even the Saudi Arabia against Iran. I doubt it. I think it's very unlikely. But it certainly adds another element, another dimension to this kind of sense in Iran that it is more vulnerable than it used to be. Last but not least, I would at least mention the recent events in Afghanistan, which are very important in my view, and I think we should all follow what's going on in Afghanistan. As someone who has been following the Iranian media regularly, there are a lot of commentaries published by Iranian press about this, about the implications of the U.S. Withdrawal from Afghanistan and the possibility that the Taliban might regain control over Afghanistan. We all remember that the new commander, he's not so new, the commander of the Quds Force, Rouhani, has a very good background of dealing with Afghanistan, so I cannot rule out the possibility that Iran might want to shift some of its efforts from other places to Afghanistan if that's required. My last remark concerns the new government in Israel. And again, I think we should not overestimate the importance of the new government in Israel, because when it comes to Iran, there is no real difference between Israeli politicians from various factions within Israeli politics towards Iran. Certainly not when it comes to the concern of Iran's nuclear program, and the Israeli official position has remained the same. The United States should not go back to the JCPOA. Again, just let me say I do not represent the official position of the State of Israel. I have my own positions, but the position of the state of the government of Israel, both the Netanyahu's government and the Bennett government, is the same. The United States should continue the maximum pressure policy against Iran and should not go back to the JCPOA. The only change it seems to happen is perhaps a slightly more pragmatic Israeli approach towards the United States when it comes to its decision to go back to the JCPOA. So while Netanyahu said we should not discuss anything with the United States other than our objection to the US return to the JCPOA, it seems to me that the tone has changed a little bit. And the Israeli current new government has perhaps decided to maintain its differences with the United States away from the public eyes and ears, which in my view is very good. And when it comes to the regional issue, again, there is no real difference between the Israeli government's efforts to limit or to delay Iran's entrenchment mainly in Syria and to limit the extent of deliveries of weapons to Hezbollah is a major issue in Israel, and this will not stop. Just may I say a final issue, a final sentence, which is I believe that what's going to happen in Vienna will have major implications on the Israeli position, because if there is a return to the JCPOA in Vienna and Iran is forced to roll back again its nuclear capabilities and return to the place where it was after the JCPOA was signed, which is approximately 1 year away from breakout capability, this, I think, might not change dramatically the Israeli position, but it might create a sense of less sense of urgency in Israel to continue its efforts against Iran's nuclear program. I'll stop here and elaborate perhaps later.
Fascinating. Dr. Raz, it was really insightful. and the way especially you have said that there is absolutely no difference or the similarity of views between various factions in Israeli politics. In fact, it's interesting to note even the similarity of dreams Iran and Israel have been chasing. For Israel has been recognized as a regional power. It has been chasing a dream of being recognized as a state. Iran has been recognized as a state. It has been chasing the dream of being recognized as a regional power. The dreams of both are intellectual in nature, which cannot be solved by the military, perhaps. But we have many questions coming up, and we can start with the first question that has been directed to Professor Doraj. It is coming from Mahmoud Bonshipuri, and I'll just read it. What is the possibility of reaching an agreement with the current government in Tehran within the context of the JCPOA negotiations before the conservative government of Raisi takes over power in August 2021? Professor Doraj, the question, if you could answer that.
Well, regarding the JCPOA, I'm a bit more optimistic than any follow-on negotiation because both sides have something in stake. For Biden administration, the real focus of the Biden administration is competition on the global stage with China and Russia. Great power politics is what is on top of the agenda. Iran in that regard is a nuisance, right? And that's why Biden administration has given its blessing to the negotiation that has been going on between Iran and Saudi Arabia, wants to see some de-escalation that would, following US withdrawal from Afghanistan, will continue in the sense not that the US troops are going to be withdrawn, but decreasing its footprint so it can focus more on the Pacific theater, if you will. So that's one. And for Iran, they are in desperate financial strait. They need that. And even if they want to have a very successful relation with China, they need that is economic ties with China. They need JCPOA so they can do the banking, they can sell their oil, all of that. So for Iran is also very crucial that they get to JCPOA. And on that, I think both sides have an understanding that for US, they want to put Iran nuclear profile, genie back in the bottle, so to speak, or defang Iran from that possibility of having a nuclear weapon. And for Iran, they need the financial relief. So that makes me think that there's a will here, there would be a way. And we would have an agreement at the end of the day, if on minor issues or minute issues of what sort of sanctions should be on the table for negotiation and what US is willing to grant as sanction relief and what is not. I think if we get a major understanding on that, then I think we are very likely to have a JCPOA agreement.
Thank you so much. I was just looking at the other question. Thank you so much for this answer. And we have another question from Lee to any speaker. And that is, what are the chances of reconciliation between Iran and the West and ending the Middle Eastern Cold War with Saudi Arabia? And would the new Iranian administration consider an end to the proxy wars in Yemen and Syria? So who would like to pick up that question? Anyone? Anyone from the panelists can answer that question.
Well, I think we have to make a distinction between the Iranian attitude towards the so-called West, especially the United States, which in my view is not going to change. Again, because as I said before, and as Dr. Pagu has said, this is not a governmental or presidential decisions, but mainly a state decisions to be decided by the Supreme Leader and the Supreme National Security Council. And when it comes to Iran's attitudes towards the United States, not only there is no difference, but I personally believe that Trump's decision to leave the JCPOA actually increased this sense of Supreme Leader Khamenei that the United States should not be trusted. So as Raisi said himself, I will not hold a phone talk with President Biden. With all due respect, it's not his decision, and even if he wanted to do that, Khamenei would probably not give him the permission to do that. When it comes to the regional policy, again, I think the Iranian position is quite clear. It is willing to discuss regional issues with everyone, but not with the involvement of the Western, especially not the United States participation. So Iran has been saying again and again, we are willing to discuss regional issues. We are willing to discuss our interference and our involvement in Syria or in Iraq, but on two conditions. One is that we will discuss that in addition to the other countries' involvement in those countries. So if you want to discuss Iran's interference in Iraq, let's discuss Saudi interference in Yemen, for example. And the second condition is that mainly the United States should be out of this issue. So I think that what we've seen in recent months between Iran and Saudi Arabia discussing certain issues, mainly the Yemenite crisis in Iraq, will probably continue. But again, this is a decision to be made mainly by the Supreme National Security Council.
Thank you so much. And before moving on to the second question, which has been in the written form, I would encourage our audience to please raise your hand and ask it yourself. I think maybe it can be better communicated. And I have another question for Dr. Pargu from Mahmoud Monishpuri, and that is, Raisi is going to move Iran further economic and political ties with China. Raisi is going to move Iran towards further economic and political ties with China. Will this move serve Iran's national security interests in the long run? A very, very deep question, I would suggest. Dr. Mahmoud, that question is for you.
Yeah, thank you. I don't think, again, that Raisi's approach to China would be significantly different from Rouhani, or for that matter, probably other reformists if they were able to become president, because relations with China is inevitable at the moment. You have to, if you, as a country, as a government, you want to do business with the world. Right now, your only way is China. And even if U.S. sanctions are lifted, again, China always have been there as a big global power, and increasingly inserting influence in the Middle East. So Iran, as part of BRI, currently Iran is not playing a significant role in BRI, basically because of U.S. sanctions. So just imagine that if even these sanctions were not there, Iran would have been much more part of Chinese, say, BRI project. So it looks like currently Iran has no choice. Even if sanctions are not removed, okay, the possibilities of cooperation, economic cooperation with China would be limited because of all those sanctions. I think if they are lifted, of course, it will be extended, but it's not about Raisi. Anybody who comes at the moment in the current situation in Iran, and probably even the reformists, they will start, and just don't forget that Chinese probably right now should be 45% or something of oil import comes from the Middle East. China looks very strategically to Iran, because Iran is the only oil exporter to China that is not under heavy influence of the West side. So it's strategic, I guess. And Raisi probably is not that much different from others in that matter.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mahmoud. And we have a gentleman raising his hand from the floor, Mr. Jassim Ulub. Please, if you could unmute yourself and ask your question. Thank you.
Yeah, this is Jassim from Bahrain. Greetings to all, really. Really, my question is this: there is this thought that the IRGC would become in control of many things in Iran. You know, they're already in control of the parliament, then they could become through Raisi in control of the president's office, and possibly even of the office of the supreme leader. I mean, is this true or really exaggerated and said by Iran's enemies? That's one. The second one is that there's also this talk that Raisi could really become the next supreme leader, you know, given the fact that he was really popularly elected, that the current supreme leader came from the same area, that he was elected and then became president. Is this a true scenario, or again, it's not true? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Jaseen. And any of the panelists would like to take on that question? Please go ahead. Oh, okay. Dr. Sanam, please go ahead.
Thank you. Hello, Dr. Jassim. Good to hear your voice. I'm happy to take on and offer some of my thoughts on both of the questions. The IRGC's role, I don't think, is exaggerated. The IRGC has been a very important institution that Iran's supreme leader has come to rely on as part of his process of gaining greater legitimacy and institutionalizing and broadening the role and responsibility of his office in the Iranian system. I, however, don't see the IRGC as the sole actor of influence and importance within the Iranian system. Dr. Zimt referred to a paper I had written on the Iranian deep state, and I think that the system is much more reliant on complex set of actors that are involved in the military, intelligence, and security, all connected to the supreme leader. So if you look at institutions of influence or individuals of influence, I could also point to, they're connected to the intelligence office, the judiciary, the IRGC, also the parastatal economic foundations that are hugely important for patronage and to provide financial assets and support to the state. So I think taken together, they all play a very important role. And they share a view that the Islamic Republic, as it exists, must be protected. They're working to prevent the transformation of the Islamic Republic. So that's my view. Of course, there are others that see the IRGC as the most important actor, but interestingly, in this election, we didn't see the great takeover of Iran by the IRGC. So perhaps we have to question that assumption. I think the IRGC is a really instrumental part of the system, but I don't know if it has the capacity and capability to break the system and become an independent actor. And secondly, on Raisi as a potential successor, I think he is indeed a successor, potentially, but the process, of course, is going to be very opaque. Raisi also sits in the Assembly of Experts, the institution responsible for selecting the next supreme leader. Generally, I mean, we've only seen a transition once, but the successor comes from within the Assembly of Experts itself. And that's why in past elections, we've seen the candidate, the vetting of Hassan Khamenei, for example, into that body because they want to remove him as a potential successor. I think that much depends on Raisi's legacy and how Raisi manages his tenure as president. Yes, he's ticked the box and he's following in Khamenei's footsteps. And I think that he is a mirror image of Khamenei, so that makes him a reliable actor. But much depends on consensus that will be built over the next few years. There's also rumors of a constitutional reform process that could also emerge in the next few years. So there are many unknowns. We're really looking into a black box. And I think that there are, of course, other candidates that are on the short list that we have to discuss and think about perhaps in the future as well.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sanam. And Ebrahim Raisi's father-in-law is also in that council of experts. So there are two people in the family. So I think very high likelihood of that. Now we have the next question from one of our own colleagues at MEI, Dr. Jonah Blank. If you could unmute yourself and ask the question, Jonah. Dr. Blank, can you hear us?
Okay, yes.
Okay, no problem.
Let's see. My apologies. Okay, my apologies. My question is about the possibility of Raisi becoming the supreme leader. My understanding is that he lacks the theological expertise to become the supreme leader, that it would be a very highly politicized decision. And I'm, as an anthropologist of Islam, among other things, I just was surprised that people were referring to this as a live possibility. But my expertise really is not in Ithna Ashari Shi'ism. Perhaps one of these speakers could discuss this issue.
Sure. I mean, the question is open to everyone. I see Dr. Mahmood, you're raising your hand, and Dr. Raz also. Okay, everyone, please, starting with Dr. Mahmood.
First, I don't think theological relevance of Raisi is that much important at the moment. You know, just compare it to Khamenei when he became supreme leader. His theological credentials were much less than current Raisi. So, and right now, apparently many people are starting to call him with the title Ayatollah. And so it looks like it would be easy for them if they decide. And also consider this fact that this theological credentials has lost its importance in the last few decades. You know, Khamenei, everybody knows, is not Khomeini. Khomeini he was like a manifestation of a Shiite Imam. He has so much charisma, but Khamenei was not there. Khamenei, many people don't look at him as too much, you know, religious rather than political. So it's more about politics these days, and those are only, say, probably some formalities and paperwork for legal paperwork for them. And second issue is that we really don't know if Raisi is being Raisi becoming president paves the way for him to become the supreme leader, or just absolutely opposite. Because some people have this, theory that probably some sections of power are trying to bring Raisi to the spotlight so that he engages in the everyday running of country. And when you are president, then problems start. You can't solve problems. You can't solve immediate problems of economy and many things. And then discontent and this protest from people start, criticizing, and you lose that charisma that leadership needs. So it's a theory that probably they are just want to burn him, like they burnt Sadiq Larijani, they burnt many other prominent candidates for the leadership.
Okay, Dr. Raz, and then maybe Professor Doraz. Dr. Raz, please.
Yeah, well, I totally agree with what Dr. Pargoz said, and just to remind our audience that following Khomeiни's death in 1989, they actually had to change the Iran's constitution and to separate between the so-called marja'iyat and the so-called velayat in order to enable someone like Khamenei, who is not a marja'i taqlid, to become the next supreme leader of Iran. So that's, of course, relevant to Ebrahim Raisi as well. And a short remark concerning the IRGC, and continues to what Sanam has said. I think we should refrain from referring to the IRGC as a monolithic organization. There are different approaches within the IRGC, and when you remember perhaps that one of the IRGC ex-functionaries, Saeed Mohammad, decided to run in the president's in the recent elections, it actually caused some bad reactions from some of his fellow IRGC members. So I think that we should really remember that there are different interests, different approaches within the IRGC. So we should not consider the IRGC as a monolithic organization.
Okay,
Yes, if I
yeah,
may
please,
add
please go ahead.
something, yes, to that briefly. There was also a good deal of speculation that soon to be former President Rouhani was being groomed perhaps as the next supreme leader. And we know what happened to him in 2 terms in the office, that, politicking, and as American political scientists call it, sausage making, which is everyday politicking, does not necessarily help you to develop a name or a reputation which is unscarred by politics, that would position you well for that office of the supreme leader. That's number one. The second thing that is important to note is that the Iranian politics has proven to be tremendously fluid, full of, in some ways, contradiction, and full of spontaneity, that all the post-colonial states can be subverted by mass action. And that's perhaps more true about Iran than some of the other examples that we can think of. And the reason I say this is that we often think that the office of supreme leader is omnipresent and omnipotent and calls all the shots and everybody follows in line. That's not necessarily the case. His office has one voice, very significant and powerful voice, but nevertheless one voice. There are other forces, other groups. This is the system that tolerated the ascendance of Khatami to presidency and all the civil society activities that we saw flourishing under Khatami. That's what I mean. So it's not a monolithic political entity that we can simply, through some conventional wisdom, say that, okay, I agree with the assessment that we cannot even put Raisi in a box, that because he comes from the hardline faction, he's gonna act like this or that or that. No, great deal of what would motivate his behavior or set his agenda has to do with a very vibrant Iranian society that came in post-revolutionary period out of a mass movement and a revolution that involved participation of large number of people, that legitimizes, still at least controlled, subverted, engineered, but still sees it necessary to legitimize its existence through elections. And we must take note of that. I think that's what sets Iran apart from other authoritarian states.
Thank you so much, Professor Durraj. Dr. Sanam, would you like to join in?
Thank you, Dr. Shuja. I think my colleagues have really covered the topic fully, so I'm not going to venture in on this one.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. And my apologies to the audience because I am not able to give them a follow-up chance because we have so many questions here. And in fact, there are 3 questions for, I'm just clubbing them together for Dr. Raz. I'll just read them. Israel always sees Iran as the main threat in the region. How will Iranian government respond to Israel's maneuvering of diplomatic closeness with the Arab countries? That is question number 1. Then question number 2, the first is from Santo Warman. The second question from Mahmoud Monshipuri is for Dr. Raz. Iran has been the major beneficiary of political instability in the region. It's a loaded question. Iran thrives on crisis in the region. And then, why should we assume that Iran faces difficult challenges? Because there are so many conflicts in the region already. That is second. The third question from Mehdi, again for Dr. Raz. Does Israel support regime change in Iran? That would be my question also. What is Israel's policy towards regime change in Iran? Dr. Raz, if you could answer this question.
Yeah, well, I'll try to address them very briefly. Look, I think that it's natural to assess that Iran is not pleased with the rapprochement between Israel and some of the Arab states in the Gulf. I think the main concern in Iran is the possibility that this cooperation, which is not new, by the way, but it's now more public, between Israel and the Gulf states might evolve into a more, I would say, military, perhaps security or intelligence Israeli presence in the Persian Gulf, which is of course a main concern. I'm not sure that we should overestimate this new anti-Iranian Israeli Arab coalition, because at the end of the day, we all know that Saudi Arabia and UAE and other countries in the region have their own interests. And I think there is also a slight difference between the way Israel has been concerning Iran and the attitude of some of our new friends in the Gulf towards Iran. For example, Israel main concerns is the nuclearization of Iran, while other countries in the region put more focus on the missiles, for example, and on Iran's regional involvement in those states. So I think, yes, there is potential for concern for Iran, but I'm not sure that Iran considers this cooperation between Israel and the Gulf state as a zero-sum game. They continue to do business, for example, with the UAE, despite the fact that the UAE and Israel have now diplomatic ties. I'm not sure I remember the second question, but the third question was, look, I don't remember that Israeli politicians, including Prime Minister Netanyahu, has publicly supported the idea of a regime change. But I think it's very obvious that Israel, or the official Israelis, consider a regime change in Iran as perhaps the only real solution to the main threats coming from Iran. The problem is that regime change is not to be carried out by Israel. I mean, with all due respect to the abilities and capabilities of the Mossad, but we hardly can carry out regime change in Gaza. So when it comes to Iran, it's even more complicated. So I think the main concern in Israel is that when you look at those two timelines, one is the nuclearization of Iran, and the second one is the prospects for regime change. The main concern in Israel is that Iran will become a nuclear threshold state before the regime changes in Iran.
Thank
sorry,
you so
I
much.
don't remember the second question.
No problem. I'll remind you of that, because that is actually a very pertinent question, and of course linked to what you have said. Is that you have alluded to the conflicts that are being faced by Iran as something that is sort of problem. Okay, the questionnaire asks that Iran actually thrives on the conflict. In fact, that is reminded me the other discussion by Kenneth Katzman. You know, Dr. Sanam Vakil will remember that if these conflicts are removed, then the Iranian problem would be solved.
Okay.
So if you could, Dr.
I totally agree that Iran flourishes more in times of crisis in other countries. That's why I mentioned the stabilization in Iraq and Syria is one of the reasons for the growing problems Iran have. But we have to remember that in addition to chaos in the Middle East, which might give Iran more opportunities to increase its involvement, as I said, there are other issues. For example, the existence of more than one player in the region which competes with Iran, Israeli efforts, Russian competition with Iran, and the growing opposition within the Arab world, mainly among public opinion in our Arab world against Iran, the killing of Soleimani and all the other problems, which make it more difficult to Iran to increase its influence, even though there are still opportunities to use. And I agree, Iran has been very successful in chaining threats into opportunities, but still, we should not remember that as the civil war in Iraq has ended and there is more stability in Syria, there are less prospects for Iran to flourish, to entrench itself, and there are other problems as well, as I mentioned before.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ali. It was a difficult one. And before moving on to the other question that I have, I'm really little tempted to involve Dr. Mahmoud, because he has written a book and he is having this fresh memory, because during the last succession, there was a constitutional change. And looking at the constitutional aspect of it, do you foresee any more constitutional change during the next succession? If you could, that's my question.
Yeah, it's It's a difficult question and really difficult to predict because Khamenei a few years ago, probably even 8 years ago or something, I don't remember exactly the date, he alluded to the possibility that why not a parliamentarian system? Why should we insist on presidential system? So I think, this discussion and debate didn't follow up by Khamenei or many conservatives, and apparently it was dried out, back then. But what happened is that instead of changing the constitution, it looks like the regime tries to make this balance between, the risk of election and the rewards of election, with doing three things. First of all, in the last 12 years, they have been very, very restrictive about the candidates. So you have this very restrictive policy, and it's always increasing. So the possibility that really, game changer candidates and wild risk or wild cards, they can come into the elections and do some fundamental change, basically is ruled out. Second is that they have been creating many parallel organizations to parallel the president and its, power, so that even if you have somebody like Rouhani, then his power compared to 20 years ago is much, much less. So you have all these, bunyads or economic funds, you have all these, cultural institutes, you have all these media institutes. 20 years ago, you had one news agency was under control of the government. But right now you have probably 10 or more news agencies working in the government and in the country, and probably more than 80% of them, the most successful of them, are not part of the Rouhani's government or later Raisi's government. So you have all these parallel institutions. Even in higher education sector, you have all these influences coming from IRC. So this is another one. So it looks like there is not this urgency or a need to change the constitution with these, reforms, which has been taking, shaking within the last, say, 2 decades. And also in foreign policy, apart from all those structural issues, Ayatollah Khamenei's, say, influence in the government has been increasing. And right now, some countries in the region are directly managed by Ayatollah Khamenei's representatives in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and it's kind of, non-written, but known to everybody in the administration that, okay, this, for example, the Yemen's profile, Iraq's profile, say Afghanistan's profile, Venezuela's profile is being managed by Ayatollah Khamenei. This is not somebody else's, prerogative to enter. So I don't think that we need any kind of, constitutional change. So in other terms, we are entering into a kind of smart electoral authoritarianism. Before it was difficult to manage, but right now, I think the regime really is becoming very smart to how to manage all these, controversies, instead of changing the very text of the law. I guess, yeah.
Yeah, regime would be very happy. You have called them smart. So thank you so much for your answer. And Professor Durraj, you had promised me that you will touch upon Iran-China relation, because you see, Ali Larijani was a candidate, a very potential candidate. He was disqualified, and he is the person who has been deputed by Ayatollah Khamenei to be the point man for this particular relationship. So how does his disqualification impact, because that is also linked to the election, the impact Iran-China relationship? If you could answer that, you had promised.
Surely, I don't think it'll be crucial. As I mentioned, there is a good deal of consensus across the factional divide in Iran that relation with China is necessary, but essential for regime survival. And also the whole unpredictability of political power and transitional political power in the United States, which was the lesson that Iranian government drew from Trump phenomenon and all the policies that ensued under Trump makes us believe that the US cannot be relied upon as any possible future economic partner, etc. In fact, the Iranian negotiators early on coined the idea of $16 billion of Boeing contract that during the Obama administration negotiation was on the table, that might be resurrected, but the Biden administration did not show any interest in doing that. So all of this, I think, makes them to conclude that relation with China is essential, but they also see China as an emerging economic power, which has very little history of conflict, and one of the few countries that played an essential role in reconstruction of Iran after war against Saddam, and is highly embedded, deeply embedded in Iranian infrastructure, from broadband to building Iranian subways, roads, dams, fisheries, you name it. They have a hand in it. Just to give you an example, in 2019, during the sanctions, 48% of Iranian exports went to China, 27.5% of Iranian imports came from China. So China is indispensable for Iran's economic survival, and as a partner that they see, especially they're putting their fortune in what they see to be a major success of Belt and Road Initiative that China is undertaking. And there was a journalist in New York Times that in 2017 wrote an article. The title of the article was, "For China's Global Ambition, Iran is at the center of everything." And that, of course, refers to Iran's political geography as a gateway to Central Asia, largest coast on Persian Gulf, Caspian Sea, and through Turkey, a gateway to Europe. And that makes, but also, unlike its Arab neighbors, a country with 85 million possible consumers, a country which has a long history of relation with China and is cohesive as an entity, is a grand civilization as China is. And all of those, and also both countries have suffered through era of colonialism and what they call in China humiliation. That's the point of psychological identification that makes the two sides to gravitate to each other. And China's policies of non-intervention, respect for sovereignty and all that is music to the ears of Iranian leaders.
Thank you so much, Professor Durraj. And I have kept this question for the end because it is sharing the pain of the Iranian people, and it's a bit sad, but I'll just read it. Do you perceive, the question is from Enoch Ang, do you perceive more young people and professionals in Iran considering immigration in view of the uncertainties and lack of opportunities faced if the current sanctions continue? Do you anticipate a potential faster Iranian brain drain to the outside world? And I think this may be difficult to answer, but if you, some of you could volunteer answering this question. Sure, Sanam, please.
I'll just quickly. I mean, you know, really one of the tragedies is that Iran's largest export is not its energy resources, but it's human capital. And that's something we can say has been a consistent feature since 1979. There have been waves, larger waves, and I think most recently that larger wave came after the 2009 Green Movement. But since the protests in 2017 and 2019, there were also increased movements of people, young people in particular, leaving Iran. I would expect that if the Raisi government continues to manage the system through coercive means and not invest in the economy, creating some sort of hope or a future for young people, that brain drain is going to continue. The challenge, of course, is that doors, immigration doors are closing globally. So where Iranians are going to go, it will be